The Fat of the Land by Wilhelmir Stephenson. Chapter 8. The Blackleg in Our Time. Thus from the beginning of modern exploration had scurvy been the great enemy of the explorer. During the circumnavigation by Magellan's expedition 1519 to 1522, many died from it. When Scott's party went by sledge to the South Pole 4 centuries later, in 1912, their strength was sapped by scurvy. They were unable to maintain their travel schedule and died. Nor has scurvy been the nemesis of explorers only. In the First World War, the British Army in the Near East was seriously handicapped by it. In October 1935, an American doctor reported that 100 Ethiopian soldiers per day were dying of scurvy among the troops which struggled against the Italians. There was scurvy among United States troops in the Second World War. The disease wrought havoc during the Alaska and Yukon gold rushes following 1896, when scores of miners died from it. It was a medical delusion for several hundred years that doctors knew exactly how to prevent and how to cure scurvy. The premise from which the doctors started was that vegetables, particularly fruits, prevent blackleg. Since diet consists of animals and plants, the statement came to take the form that scurvy is caused by meat and cured by vegetables. Finally, the doctors standardized on lime juice as the best of preventatives and cures. They named it a sure cure, a specific. Lawmakers followed the doctors. It is on statute books that during long voyages the crew is to be supplied with lime juice, and induced or compelled to take it. From officers of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, I have in my notebooks many a case of suffering and death caused by scurvy in the Alaska and Yukon gold rushes. The miner generally began to sicken toward the end of winter. He had been living on beans and bacon, on fresh bread, rice, oatmeal, sugar, dried fruits, and dried vegetables. When he recognized his trouble as scurvy, he made such efforts as were possible to get the things which he believed would cure him. Apparently, the miner's faith was strongest in raw potatoes. These had to be brought from afar, and there are tales of heroic men who struggled through the wilderness to succor a comrade with a few pounds of what Alaska called spuds. There were similar beliefs in the virtue of onions and some other vegetables. Curiously, there was either no faith in those vegetables which were locally obtainable, or else a belief that they should be treated in a way which, we now understand, destroys their value. For instance, a man might have been cured with a salad of the leaves or the green bark of trees. What the miners did with the pine needles and willow bark was to cook them for hours and drink the tea. If they had fresh meat, which would have been curative as an underdone steak or roast, they boiled it to shreds and drank the broth. Death frequently occurred in 2 to 4 months. Ignoring the decimation of armies which has been taking place in our time, and the burden of scurvy in many walks of civil life through past ages, we turn to the explorers, the class most widely publicized as suffering from and dying of scurvy. It is usual to rank Captain James Cook of the late 18th century with the foremost explorers of the time, part of which fame rests on the assertion that he discovered how to prevent and cure scurvy. Medical books name him as pioneer in the field, saying that we owe to him the conquest of a dread disease. For he demonstrated that with vegetables, again particularly fruits, scurvy could be prevented on the longest voyages. By statement or inference, the books assert that from this developed the knowledge according to which we extract and bottle the juice of the lime, stock ships with it, prevent and cure scurvy. The good physicians retained their faith in lime juice as a specific by overlooking its constant failure upon severe test. How stoutly the medical profession kept the faith is shown in connection with many a British polar expedition, for instance, that of Sir George Nares. When he returned home in 1876, after a year and a half in the field, he reported much illness from scurvy, some deaths, and a partial failure of his exploration program as a result. In his own view, fresh meat could have saved his men. But the doctors, as will be seen when we consider how they later advised Scott, soon forgot whatever impression was made by the opinion of Nares and the facts he adduced to support it. They seem to have squared themselves with the old doctrines by a series of assumptions: that the lime juice used by the Nares expedition failed because it was deficient in acid content, that some of the victims did not take as much of it as was needed, and that, perhaps, it was too much to expect even the marvelous juice to cope with all the northern conditions which tended, in the view of that time, to bring on scurvy. Absence of sunlight, bad ventilation, lack of amusement and exercise, insufficient cleanliness. Particularly because the Nares Medical Court of Inquiry had closed on a note of cleanliness and modern sanitation, one would think the medical men might have felt a severe jolt when they read, some 20 years later, how Nansen and Johansen had wintered in the Franz Josef Islands in 1895 to 1896. They had lived in a hut of stones and walrus leather. The ventilation was slight to conserve fuel. The blubber fire smoked so that the air was additionally bad. Within the house there was not a ray of daylight for months, and the two men practically hibernated, seldom going outdoors at all and taking as little exercise as appears humanly possible. They never bathed and seldom washed face or hands. Yet their health was perfect all winter, and they came out of their confinement in as good physical condition as any men ever did out of any kind of Arctic wintering. Their food had been exclusively meat, the lean and the fat of walrus, eaten fresh and usually boiled. Tens, if not hundreds, of thousands of scientists in medicine and the related branches must have seen this account, for Nansen's books were best-sellers in practically every language, and newspapers were full of the story. Yet the effect upon medical practice was negligible. The doctors and dietitians still continued to pontificate on how meat produced scurvy and on the contributory bad effects on polar expeditions and in sailing ships of what they called insufficiency of ventilation, cleanliness, sunlight, and exercise. They still prescribed lime juice and put their whole dependence on it and other vegetable products. Excuses for lime juice and explanations to show why it must not be charged with seeming failures have persisted to this day. It was, for instance, demonstrated with triumph a few years ago that the meaning of lime had changed during the last 100 years. This to justify the claim that it worked better in the 18th century. Then the juice was made from lemons, called limes. Now it is made from limes, called limes, and lime juice from lemons is more potent than lime juice from limes. The antiscorbutic value of lemons may be far greater than that of limes per ounce, but that does not go to the root of the matter. For proof of this, consider how Nansen's experience was reinforced and interpreted by 4 expeditions during the following 20 years, 2 of them commanded by Robert Falcon Scott, 1 by Ernest Henry Shackleton, 1 by me. Scott, in 1900 and 1901, sought the most orthodox scientific counsel when outfitting his first Antarctic expedition. He followed advice by carrying lime juice and by picking up quantities of fruits and other vegetable things as he passed New Zealand. He saw to it that the diet was wholesome, that the men took exercise, that they bathed and had plenty of fresh air. Yet scurvy broke out, and the subsequently famous Shackleton, among others, was crippled by it on the journey. They were pulling their own sledges at the time, so they must have had enough exercise. There was plenty of light, with the unsetting sun beating upon them, and there was plenty of fresh air, for they were always out of doors. To believers in the catchwords and slogans of their day, and to believers in the virtues of lime juice, the onset of the scurvy was a baffling mystery. That it was Shackleton's scurvy which most interfered with the success of the first Scott expedition was particularly unfortunate, in the light of the jealousies it aroused, the enmities it caused. Scurvy, as diseases go, is really one of the cleanest and least obnoxious, but in English the name of it is a term of opprobrium, a scurvy fellow, a scurvy trick. Shackleton may have smarted as much under that word association as he did under the direct charge that his weakness had been Scott's main handicap. The passion to clear his name drove him to the organization of an expedition which many in Britain considered unethical. A subordinate, with indecent haste and insistence, crowding forward to eclipse his commander. The crucial element in the first Shackleton expedition, to the student of scurvy, is the fact that Shackleton was an Elizabethan throwback in the time of Edward VII. He was a Hawkins or a Drake, a buccaneer in spirit and method. He talked louder and more than is good form in modern England. He approached near to brag and swagger. He caused frictions, aroused and fanned jealousies, and won the breathless admiration of youngsters who would have followed Dampier and Frobisher with equal enthusiasm in their piracies and in their explorations. The organization and the rest of the first Shackleton expedition went with a hurrah. They were as careless as Scott had been careful. They did not have Scott's type of backing, scientific or financial. They arrived helter-skelter on the shores of the Antarctic continent, pitched camp, and discovered that they did not have nearly enough food for the winter. Nor had they used such painstaking care as Scott to provide themselves with fruits and other antiscorbutics in New Zealand. Compared with Scott's, their routine was slipshod as to cleanliness, exercise, and several of the ordinary hygienic prescriptions. What is important is that Scott's men, with unlimited quantities of jams and marmalades, vegetables and fruits, grains, curries, and potted meats, had been little inclined to add seals and penguins to their dietary. With Shackleton, it was neither wisdom nor the acceptance of good advice, but dire necessity which drove him to such use of penguin and seal that Dr. Alliston Forbes Mackay, physician from Edinburgh, who was a member of that Shackleton expedition, and later physician of my ship, the Carlook, told me that he estimated half the food during their stay in the Antarctic was fresh meat. In spite of the lack of care, indeed, as it now appears, because of that lack, Shackleton's expedition had better average health than Scott's. There was never a sign of scurvy. Every man retained his full strength, and they accomplished that spring what most authorities still consider the greatest physical achievement of southern exploration. With men dragging the sledges a considerable part of the way, they got to latitude 88 degrees 23 minutes south, practically within sight of the pole. Just short of a decade after the first exploration, Scott began his second venture as he had begun the first, by asking the medical men of Britain for protection from scurvy, and by receiving from them once more the good old advice about lime juice, fruits, cleanliness, ventilation, and the rest. In winter quarters he again placed reliance on that advice and on constant medical supervision, on a planned and carefully varied diet, on numerous scientific tests to determine the condition of the men, on exercise, fresh air, sanitation, in all its standard forms. The men lived on the foods of the United Kingdom, supplemented by the fruit and garden produce of New Zealand. Now, as on their previous expedition, they had with them so much which they were used to that they ate comparatively little of what they had never learned to like, the lean and fat of penguins and seals. They apparently ate a good deal more on the second than on the first Scott expedition of fresh animal food, but clearly not as much as the Shackleton party had used, as can be seen from the sequel. In 1911, as in 1902, they started their sledge travel after a winter of sanitation. On the first expedition the results had been disappointing. Now they were tragic. Scurvy did not prevent them from reaching the South Pole, but it commenced to sap their strength in the early part of the return journey, and progressed so rapidly that their growing weakness prevented them, if only by a few miles, from being able to get back to the final provision depot. Those who have ignored the scurvy have sometimes claimed that if Scott had reached the depot, he would have been able to make his way eventually to the base camp 150 miles away. This becomes more than doubtful when you realize that the progressive decrease of vigor, both mental and physical, was not going to be averted by even the largest meals, if those meals were of food lacking antiscorbutic value. The story of Scott and his companions, especially through the last few weeks, is among the noblest in any language. Through it they became national heroes and world heroes. But in the speech of their countrymen, though not in many another European tongue, scurvy sounds unclean. It appeared necessary to Scott's surviving comrades, and to those in Britain who knew the truth, to take care that the tabooed word should not sully a glorious deed. To suppress the association of an abhorred disease by playing up the beauty and heroism of Scott's death may have been worth while at the time, but it can scarcely be deplored by anyone, and must be praised by scientists, that Commander Edward R. G. R. Evans, later Admiral, Scott's second in command, after a time gave out the information about scurvy, including the statement that he himself had been afflicted. It is irrational, at least now that emotions have calmed, to blame Scott. No one was to blame, for they all acted according to the light of their day. If anyone was to blame, it was primarily those who gave medical advice to the expedition before it sailed. Secondarily, it was the chief medical officer of the party, rather than the commanding officer. It seems strange, now, that a comparison of the Scott and Shackleton experiences did not fully enlighten the doctors on the true inwardness of scurvy. But of course, part of the explanation is that some of the Scott medical information was suppressed. Therefore it remained for my own expeditions to demonstrate, so far as polar explorers are concerned, and for the Russell Sage studies, to call to the attention of the medical profession the most practical and only simple way of preventing and curing scurvy. For no matter how good the juice of limes, or lemons, it is difficult to carry in bulk. It deteriorates, whether in bulk or a pill, and it may be lost as by a shipwreck. The thing to do is to find the antiscorbutics where you are. Pick them up as you go. This can be done in the Arctic, on sea and land, everywhere except on the inland ice of Greenland. In the Antarctic it can be done on the coasts, where penguins and seals abound, and are easier to secure than any beasts of the far north. But it cannot be done there inland, for land game is wanting from the interior of the southern continent. On my third expedition it happened, as circumstantially related in my book called The Friendly Arctic, that 3 men came down with scurvy through disobeying the instructions of the commander, and living without his knowledge for 2 or 3 months, chiefly on stored foods, when they were supposed to be living chiefly on fresh meat. It seems to take from 1 to 3 months for even a bad diet to produce easily recognizable scurvy. In the case of my men, it was about 3 weeks after they first noticed the trouble, and about 10 days after they complained of it to me, when one of them had become so weak we had to carry him on a sledge, while the other was barely able to stagger along, holding on behind. By then every joint hurt, their gums were as soft as cheese, their teeth so loose that they came out with almost the gentlest of pulls. We were 60 or 80 miles from land on drifting sea ice when the trouble started, and we hastened ashore to get a stable camp for the invalids, and made it in a week or so of sledging. It would have been no fun, with sick men on our hands, if an ice floe that was the site of our camp had started disintegrating under pressure, the fragments tumbling about and drifting in various directions. We reached an island about 900 miles north of the Arctic Circle, the coast of which was known although the interior had never been explored. We traveled a few miles inland, established a camp, hunted caribou, there were 2 of us out of 4, and began the all-meat cure. Fuel was pretty scarce, so we cooked only 1 meal a day. Besides, I thought raw food might work better. We cooked the breakfast in a pot of water. The patients finished the boiled meat while it was hot, drank some of the broth warm, and kept the remainder to drink cold during the rest of the day. For their other meals they ate slightly frozen raw meat, with normal digestion and good appetite. We divided up the caribou in ordinary Eskimo style, so the dogs got organs and entrails, hams, shoulders, and tenderloin, while the invalids and we hunters got heads, briskets, ribs, pelvis, and the marrow from the bones. On this diet all pain and gloom disappeared within 4 days. Inside of a week, both men said that they had no realization of being ill as long as they lay still abed. In 2 weeks they were able to begin traveling, at first riding on the sledges and walking alternately. At the end of a month they felt as if they had never been ill. No signs of the scurvy remained except that the gums, which had receded from the teeth, never quite regained their position. By comparing notes later with Dr. Alfred Hess, mentioned previously as a leading New York authority on scurvy, I found that when I was getting these results with a diet from which all vegetable elements were absent, he was getting similar results in a similar length of time through a diet where the main reliance was upon grated raw vegetables and fruits and upon fresh fruit juices. There is no doubt, as the quantitative studies have shown, that the percentage of vitamin C, commonly looked upon as the scurvy-preventing factor, is higher in certain vegetable elements than in any meats. But it is equally true, for some reason or another, that if one has considerable fresh meat in his diet every day, and does not overcook it, there will be enough of whatever prevents scurvy to do the preventing. It is clear, then, that if one lives exclusively on fresh meat, he gets from it enough vitamins not only to prevent scurvy, but, as I have said, to prevent all other deficiency diseases as well. We proceed to a consideration of whether it is essential that meat be fresh in order to have antiscorbutic values. The article, Observations on 3 Cases of Scurvy, mentioned already as published by me in the Journal of the American Medical Association in 1918, created a bit of a sensation within that limited circle which took it seriously, for I was in effect announcing that scurvy could be cured about as quickly and effectively by an all-meat diet, which was then supposed to have no curative value, as by a diet containing any or all of the recognized antiscorbutics, such as the juices of limes and lemons. It was assumed by me at the time, and was no doubt taken for granted by most readers, that this cure was effected by the meat because it was fresh, that it could not have been effected had the meat been preserved by salting or drying. It is beginning to seem now that perhaps the cure might have been accomplished by using dehydrated meats, almost certainly not by salted meats, for nothing seems better established than the absence from them of qualities preventative of this disease. The suggestion that dehydrated meat is preventive of scurvy, or at least not provocative, is bound to seem reasonable to students of the frontier, particularly to those who specialize in the fur trade. For, in reading the source documents and the histories, one continually runs into such striking contrasts as those between coastal Hudson's Bay Company posts, where scurvy was troublesome, and inland posts, where the disease was rare or absent. Thus preoccupied as most people have been the last 20 years with the idea that the near worthlessness of lime juice in the sailing ship days was due to its usually being too old, and that an antiscorbutic should be fresh in order to be effective, it has usually been assumed that the explanation of scurvy on the coast, against freedom from it inland, lay in the fact that cereals and salted meats brought from Europe were the chief foods at seaports, their place being taken by fresh meats in the interior. But analysis of the historical records will tend to show, though it may not demonstrate fully, that if dehydrated meats were as conducive to scurvy as are porridge, bread, and salted meats, then there should have been a good deal of scurvy on the interior of North America. For there were every now and then such periods of misfortune in the hunt or fishery that both Europeans and natives lived for months at a time with as little fresh meat to supplement their inland diet of pemmican and jerky as the coast dwellers had to supplement their imported salt meats and cereals. On European preserved meats, bread, and porridge, scurvy seems always to have developed, if the period of deprivation from fresh meats lasted several months. In a corresponding spell of jerky and pemmican, the scurvy appears never to have shown itself, or at any rate so seldom that the belief grew within the fur trade that salted meat was a cause and dried meat a cure. But this is a question to be developed hereafter, in the chapters on pemmican. So far as I have been able to canvass the record for North and South America, scurvy appears to have been far less serious here, at the time of the first explorations, than in Europe, the difference corresponding approximately to the lower agricultural status of the New World. In Europe, scurvy may not have been unknown 2,000 years ago. It seems to have increased steadily with that relative decrease in the importance of hunting, fishing, and pastoral life, which accompanied progress in the cultivation of cereals. About the worst scurvy centuries of northern Europe were, seemingly, the late Middle Ages and early modern times, when flesh foods became less and less common among the peasantry, with greater and greater dependence on porridge and bread, with doubtless also a parallel increase in the use of salt for the preservation of meats, as against an earlier custom of slaughtering animals when food was needed, or of preserving meat by drying it. The tendency in Britain and the rest of northern Europe toward increased scurvy was finally arrested and reversed by a growing dependence upon gardens as against grain fields. For there was a certain force in the medical doctrine that vegetables and fruits would prevent and cure scurvy. It was a salutary doctrine when applied at home, through the eating of one's own or a neighbor's garden produce, though of little worth when applied by the medical profession to the preserved juices of the lime and lemon that were often nearly or quite as well aged as the wines that were carried on long seafaring and exploring journeys. In the extreme south of South America, on whichever side of the Magellan Strait, there seems from the record to be no indication of scurvy, active or subclinical, as long as the people lived in native style. These groups were non-agricultural hunters, fishers, and gatherers. There is no sign, indeed, of pre-white scurvy a long way northward, toward Brazil, at least so far as was discovered by research at Columbia University carried forward during 2 years, 1939 to 1941, by Gitel Poznański, as a fellow in anthropology studying the lives of the hunting peoples of South America. For northernmost North America, the evidence that scurvy was formerly absent is equally clear from parallel Columbia University anthropological studies done in the same years by Dr. Natalie Joff. No one appears ever to have reported true scurvy, in the time of early exploration, from among the Eskimos or the northern forest Indians. Footnote: as the Oxford Dictionary says, scurvy was sometimes used to mean scurfy, having scurs or scabs, and was applied to diseases like the itch. Descriptions of this sort of scurvy do appear in some of the early northern records. For instance, in Samuel Hearne, A Journey from Prince of Wales Fort in Hudson's Bay to the Northern Ocean, London, 1795, we find on pages 336 to 337, quote, "A scorbutic disorder, resembling the worst stage of the itch, is never known to prove fatal. In the younger sort it always attacks the hands and feet, not even sparing the palms and soles. Those of riper years generally have it about the wrists, insteps, and posteriors, and in the latter particularly, the blotches or boils, as they may justly be called, are often as large as the top of a man's thumb. This disorder most frequently makes its appearance in the summer, while the Indians are out on the barren ground. Obviously this is not scurvy in our sense of the word, but a disease so named by Hearne in the sense of scurfy or scabby." End footnote. Its absence from native communities is frequently remarked upon by the explorers, particularly by those who were having trouble with it among their own crews. When natives ate European food, it became evident promptly that no racial immunity was involved. For Eskimos who went along as guides in polar expeditions, or took employment with miners in Alaska, came down with scurvy like the whites, Negroes, and South Sea Islanders who made up the rest of the parties. There was, in some cases, a specious appearance of racial immunity through instances where the rest had scurvy and the Eskimos did not, but analysis of the evidence shows that the difference was in the food used. The Eskimos, though eating to some extent with the miners, would now and then get a seal, or some other local animal, of which they would eat a larger share than the rest of the company. At any rate, it seems clear that scurvy was not as common among the Indians in any part of North America as it was among whites in most parts of Europe during the 17th and 18th centuries. During this period, the Indians, although in some contact with the whites, still maintained largely their older food habits. Records which show scurvy among people living on native foods apparently go scarcely at all up into Canada, perhaps only through the Niagara Peninsula and nearby parts of Ontario, where diets are similar to those of the Iroquois in New York, who were, to a considerable extent, an agricultural people. From there southward, scurvy records grow more and more common. They do not increase uniformly southward by latitude, but are found in the more agricultural sections, depending thus on the state of culture of the natives and upon geographic features other than mere distance north or south. In primitive American agricultural communities, scurvy was recognized as a disease connected with famine, which meant that it appeared when the hunting was bad and people were compelled to live, in the main, or wholly, on stored-up cereals. There is, for instance, General de Trobriand's account of wintering in Dakota. I quote him first on scurvy among whites and then among Indians. General Philip Regis Trobriand, son of one of Napoleon's generals, made his first trip to the United States in 1841. After several visits he came here to live. In 1861 he became colonel of a French regiment from New York, and served through the Civil War, about which he published 4 Years with the Army of the Potomac, Boston, 1889, which is a translation of a work he wrote in the French language, published at Paris, 1867 to 1868. He was a brigadier general and major general in the war, but reverted to colonelcy at its close. He served in Dakota from 1867 to 1869. His journal for this period was translated from the French by George Francis Will of Bismarck, North Dakota, and is published as one of the Lakeside Classics, Chicago, 1941. It appears that General de Trobriand had the opinion, common among frontiersmen in this period, that scurvy could be prevented and cured by vegetables, whether they were fresh or not, and that it could be similarly prevented and cured by meat, but only if it were fresh. In illustration, we quote from pages 263 to 264. Wednesday, April 8th, 1868. Yesterday, in the afternoon, died 2 of our men. One of heart trouble complicated by scurvy, the other of scurvy alone. This disease has noticeably weakened our little garrison during the winter and reached its maximum during the last month. At this time, we have in the hospital 32 sick of scurvy, and 13 more are exempted from service with their companies, having only light attacks, or being convalescent and on a diet. To this number must be added 6 employees of the quartermaster who are being treated at the hospital, which makes a total of 51 cases of scurvy, equal to a fourth of the garrison. This regrettable condition is the result of the long deprivation of fresh vegetables and the infrequency of the rations of fresh meat which are distributed but twice a week. The principal food of the men consists of salt pork and salt fish, hence the sickness. Happily, the trials are approaching a conclusion, thanks to the impending arrival of the steamboats and the fresh provisions which they carry." End quote. The following year the scurvy was among the Indians. Quoting from page 355, Sunday, February 28, 1869. Upon receiving news that an epidemic is declared to exist among my Berthold Indians, especially the Crees, I have sent Dr. Goddard to make sure of the fact and to identify the disease. He has returned this morning, announcing that it was a matter of the scurvy, which had made serious ravages during the past 2 weeks. 20 or 25 of the Indians, mostly old people, have died of it, and 32 are still sick with it. The scurvy among them is a result of their privation and sufferings. They have suffered especially from cold and hunger, having nothing but a very little corn to sustain life. End quote. In an earlier generation, these Indians would likely have possessed stores of jerky and pemmican. But at Trobriand's period, meat was no longer to be had in quantity, for in 1869 the buffalo were gone, and cattle had not as yet sufficiently replaced them. Cereals had replaced pemmican as the food stored against a time of scarcity. End of chapter 8. Next chapter is the nature and early history of pemmican. we're getting into the pemmican half of the book. Pretty much the next half of the book is all about pemmican. But it's a really interesting topic. Otherwise, how could you write so much about it? So, looking forward to sharing that with you, and you will be surprised, I think. Hope you're enjoying it so far. Leave a comment if you're enjoying learning, or if you just have a comment. All right, y'all. Catch you on chapter 9. Peace.